Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sotah daf kaftet. Okay, I will warn you, we're getting to two complicated dapim, okay, which have to deal with tum'ah and tahara, laws of impurity, which always gets a little tricky because it's all sorts of things that are new concepts and maybe not new anymore, but still kind of complicated. But we'll only get there in the second part of today's daf. And there's a study guide specifically for the second part, so you can try to use that, it might help. And I also wanted to mention that if you haven't noticed, if you use the Gemara on our site, you can click and see the text of the Gemara, which is from Safaria. We've been having a lot of trouble with it for the last week. Something happened, the mechanism failed, and it's been working all this time. So they've been playing around with it, and it's done all sorts of strange things as a result. So right now, all you can see is the English text. So if that's what you have, I'm sorry. But there's a way to bypass it, which is there's something called a Safaria linker, which means that if you just are on the title where it says Sotah 27 and you click on it, you can get directly to Safaria, and it should even open up as a pop-up on your screen, which means you can follow both at the same time. So that's your workaround right now until we fix it. So just click on the title of today's daf and you should get the Hebrew and the English, and it should be fine. You should get to Safaria, which should help you. If you have any issues and you want to know how to work it, please, you can write to us and we will help you. Okay. Hopefully it will be resolved in a little while. I was hoping it wasn't going to take a week, but it seems to be taking some time. Okay, with that, we will get started. We were in the middle of this braita with Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, who were talking about, if you remember, Rabbi Akiva said, Im nitma, nitma, v'nitma. 3 psukim, one teaches you the woman. Now we're talking about a woman who's accused of being a sotah. She's already done the kinoi. She was warned. The stira, she went into the room alone. We have witnesses, and now she's waiting for the sotah process, or perhaps he divorces her, or whatever it might be. At this point, she's forbidden to her husband. She can't be with him, have relations with him, even though technically she's still married to him, but they can't have relations. Number 2, she's forbidden to the person who she suspected of committing adultery with. So this means if her husband were to die before she ever drank the sotah waters, or he divorces her, she can't marry him. And furthermore, she can't eat truma, okay, which means until she proves her innocence, if she proves her innocence, then she'd go back to eating truma. But until she proves her innocence, if she's married to a Kohen, she can't eat truma anymore, even though they're married, right? And normally that would allow her to eat truma, because maybe she's an adulterer, which would disqualify her for eating truma forever. If she's the daughter of a Kohen, and let's say her husband divorces her instead of bringing her to drink the sotah waters, she'll never be allowed to go back to her father's house to eat truma. She can live there, but she can't eat truma. Or if he drops dead before she drinks the sotah water. That's the boel. And that's the truma. So we've learned baal, boel, and truma. Now, Rabbi Yishmael says to him, why are you learning this from a pasuk? You could learn it from a vachomer, but instead of saying, why are you learning truma from a pasuk, or why are you learning the baal or the boel? Instead, he says, why are you learning that she can't marry a Kohen, which isn't what Rabbi Akiva said. But anyway, Rabbi Yishmael said, it's a simple vachomer to learn that she can't marry a Kohen. And why didn't you, right? And why are you learning it from a pasuk, even though he didn't? So we're going to have to figure that out. He says, what's the vachomer? A divorcee. Now, I'm just going through this also, we understand it well before we move on. A divorcee is allowed to eat truma. Okay, if you are married to a Kohen and you are a bat Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, you get divorced, you go back to your father's house and eat truma. Divorce doesn't disqualify you, like, for example, adultery would disqualify you. So this doesn't disqualify you, and yet it does disqualify you from marrying a Kohen. You can never marry a Kohen anymore once you're a divorcee. That's basic, says it in the Torah. A Kohen can't marry a divorcee. So it does disqualify for marrying a Kohen, even though it doesn't disqualify from truma. So this woman who's forbidden to eat truma, wouldn't it be obvious then that she can't marry a Kohen? Because obviously kahuna is more severe if a divorcee can't marry a Kohen but can't eat truma. We're going to have a lot of vachomers today. So hope you're good with the vachomer logic, okay? Especially when we get to the truma and taras. So that's his first question against Rabbi Akiva. To which the Gemara said, well, what are you talking about? Rabbi Akiva didn't even mention kahuna. Okay, so why are you questioning him and say, why'd you learn that from a pasuk? You could have learned it from a vachomer. And secondly, we ended with this question, Rabbi Akiva kahuna manale. Where does he even learn kahuna? And if you want to say that maybe he learns kahuna, lo tzarich kra, maybe you don't even need a pasuk to teach that the sotah can't marry a Kohen. Well, we're going to prove not, because what would be the logic that Rabbi Akiva could say why it would be obvious that a Sotah can't marry a Kohen? It would be maybe because who can't marry a Kohen? Rusha, divorcee, Zonah, a prostitute, and Chalala. Okay, we're not going to get into Chalala right now, but a Zonah. Now, maybe you'd say a Sotah, right? What is she basically? She's a Safek Zonah. Maybe she's a Zonah. So if you want to say, we know that in Torah law, we're often strict. So this woman who perhaps is a Zonah, so she would be logical to say she can't marry a Kohen because she's a Safek Zonah. Well, and that's why you wouldn't need a pasuk. But on that same account, then you wouldn't need a pasuk for truma either, because a Zonah can't eat truma. So, right, that's a disqualification. Again, if I'm a bat Kohen and I sleep around while I'm married to someone and I sleep with somebody else, I can't go back to, even if my husband divorces me, I can't go back to my father's house and eat truma because I was a Zonah. So, truma nami lo tibaikra, then he wouldn't need a pasuk to prove truma on that same tone. So that means if he needs a pasuk for truma, he's going to need a pasuk for Kohen also. Because you would say it doesn't need a pasuk either. Because you made, right? Then the safek zonah would be considered a zonah, both for truma and for kahuna, and you wouldn't need a pasuk at all. So basically the question is, so what, if that's the case, we do need a pasuk to learn kahuna. So where do we learn kahuna from? Or where does Rabbi Akiva learn it? So now we're going to answer both those questions in one answer, we're going to basically say, it doesn't say these words, but we're going to amend the Braita and say the following. Rabbi Akiva arba'a kraiktive, and it's not a crazy answer because we're going to say the following. Rabbi Akiva has 4 drashot, not 3. One for Baal, the husband, one for the Boel, the one she slept with or was suspected of sleeping with, one for Truma, and one for Kuna. Now, how does he get 4? We had Nitma, Im Nitma, Vinitma. That's 3 psukim. But what did we learn about Rabbi Akiva? Vav includes a 4th. So there you have your 3 psukim, which really teach you 4 things because of the extra vav, okay, which matches what we've been seeing about Rabbi Akiva all along. So this actually makes a lot of sense. So arba'a kraiktiva, there's 4 psukim really. It's 3 that become 4 because of the vav, the end. Chad l'ba'al, chad l'boel, chad l'kuna, v'chad l'truma. And that's really what Rabbi Akiva said. And now Rabbi Yishmael's response makes sense. And he says, you don't need a pasuk for the Kohen because of my vachomer. Rabbi Yishmael, why doesn't he have 4 psukim? Very simply, he doesn't darshan vavim. So Rabbi Akiva tzlata kraiktiva, there's only 3 psukim according to him. Chad l'ba'al, chad l'boel, and chad l'truma. And where does he learn that she can't marry a Kohen? From a vachomer. Once you have truma, you can get to the vachomer and say the grusha that can eat truma but can't marry a Kohen teaches you that the Sotah who can't eat truma can't marry a Kohen either. Ukahuna ati b'vachomer. So that's what he has. The kahuna is a vachomer. Now they say, we could have gone a different way with Rabbi Yishmael. And we're going to ask, why didn't he go this way? Rabbi Yishmael, why did you go with this track and say, 3rd pasuk is truma, 4th, right? The 4th issue is learned out from a vachomer from truma, once you have truma. You could have said, Dilma ki itzrich lekahuna, utruma sharia. The vachomer proves that truma is a lighter kind of thing. So why didn't he say, we have 3 psukim, 1 for the husband, 1 for the suspected adulterer, and 1 for kahuna, she can't marry a Kohen. And truma, sharia, would be permitted. Maybe she can eat truma. Why did you go that way and assume she can't eat truma? If you only have 3, maybe drop the truma one. And since the kahuna one is in and that's more strict, that's going to be forbidden to her. But the lighter thing of truma, maybe she could eat truma. Amar lecha. So he said, if I had to choose, which is the 3rd one I'm going to add in? Is it going to be that she can't marry a Kohen, or is it going to be that she can't eat truma? Mistabra, again, he's not here to say this, Rabbi Yishmael, but we're assuming, we're putting words in his mouth. Amar lecha always means putting words in his mouth. We're assuming he could say, Mistabra dumia debalu boel. If one of them, if we're going to have to choose between she can't eat truma or she can't marry a Kohen, we're going to choose the one that's more similar to the fact that she can't marry the husband or the adulterer, the suspected adulterer. So why is, now we're going to have to say, truma is a more similar issue. Why is that? Ma bal uboel mechayim, af truma nami mechayim. This goes back to the way I described it before. The husband and the suspected adulterer are going to be forbidden to her even when her husband is still alive. Remember, either he can divorce her right? And then she can't marry the one she's suspected of being doing adultery with. Truma also, he could divorce her, and then she can't go back to her father's house and eat truma, right? Or he's still married to her and he's a Kohen, she can't eat truma anymore. These are all issues that come up whether the husband's alive or whether the husband's dead. However, la fuke kahuna de la acharmita. Kahuna only happens in one unique case. Remember, she can't obviously marry a Kohen when the husband's still alive, because either he's still alive and they're married, even though they can't have relations together, they're still married till they finish the Sotah process. Of course, she can't marry a Kohen, she's a married woman. If he divorces her, which is the other option he could take and not do the Sotah water, well, she can't marry a Kohen because she's a divorcee, not because she's a Sotah. So the only way this law could come into effect is if the husband were to die before she drank the Sotah waters. First of all, it's already a very unique case, because what are the chances that happens? And number two, it's because probably he'll either divorce her or she'll drink the Sotah water. And number two, it's not similar really to the Baal or the Boel, which happen they also happen when he dies, but this happens only when he's dead, and all the other three happen even when he's alive. So that's why the only way kuna happens is after death, and that's why if I'm going to choose one, I'm going to choose the truma, which is more similar to the Baal and the Boel. Now, Rabbi Akiva, we're assuming didn't go that way, because if Rabbi Akiva did Baal, remember, Rabbi Akiva does 4: Baal, Boel, Truma, Kahuna, in that order. Why in that order? Because if he did Baal, Boel, Kahuna first, then from the fact that she's forbidden to a Kohen, you could get to Rabbi Yishmael's vachomer and say she obviously then can't eat Truma. So, in other words, or not exactly the vachomer, but we said Kahuna is a much stricter thing. If she can't eat, no, I'm sorry, I just said it wrong. You could have said, sorry, if he went the order of Rabbi Yishmael, sorry, my mistake. If he went the order of Rabbi Yishmael and he said, Baal, Boel, Truma, once she was forbidden betruma, like Rabbi Yishmael said, you can learn vachomer to kahuna. So it must be that he didn't go that way. So now the question is, why not? Why wouldn't he say? Truma is the more obvious one because it's more similar to the Baal and the Boel. Oh, Rabbi Akiva do me a Baal or Boel lately. He doesn't think that that's a consideration. When you have 3 different psukim and each one comes to teach one thing, each one could teach random things. They don't have to be similar in any way to each other. So he doesn't hold by that, which meant that he basically went like this: husband, adulterer, she can't marry a Kohen. You might still have thought she could eat truma because truma is lighter than all that. Well, then he added the 4th drasha, added in the truma. That's one way to read Rabbi Akiva. Inami itle, alternatively, you could say he does hold by the similarity is a factor. And then what do? You say husband, adulterer, truma is forbidden. You theoretically could have learned a vachomer to kahuna, but there's a 4th pasuk anyway to teach kahuna. Why? Well, sometimes the pasuk has a drasha on something that you could have learned from a vachomer. So theoretically, maybe he does agree with Rabbi Yishmael that it goes in that order, and that the truma would come first because it's more similar to the Baal and the Boel, because all those can happen when the husband's still alive and would be relevant, which the Kohen is not a relevant factor unless he dies. And then the 4th one came to include this issue that could have been learned from a vachomer, but we're learning it anyway from a drasha, because sometimes the pasuk just does that. So that was an explanation of the machloket, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And with Rabbi Akiva, we ended up with 2 possible ways of how to read it. Okay, in the end, it's all the same. He learns it out from 4 psukim, but perhaps he also learns the 4th one from a vachomer. Now we're moving on to another issue that Rabbi Yishmael talked about. Rabbi Yishmael talked about that we're going to learn laws of safek, doubts when it comes to impurity, from learning it out from Sotah. And what did we learn? Just like Sotah happens only in the private domain, any safek of impurity, a doubt about impurity we're going to be strict about it, like a Sotah, we're strict with her, right? And forbid her to her husband. The tameh item that we're not sure is it really impure or not will be treated as tameh. Number 1, if the doubt came about in a private area, not a public space, and if there's someone there who could have known, whether it was a tama about a person, maybe the person became tameh. So again, someone theoretically could have known because there was a person involved, or there was a person in the room when the sheretz fell on wherever it fell, and we're just not sure where it fell. Now, obviously, remember, this means the person we can't ask the person for whatever reason, they went abroad, they're not here, or they just don't know, but they theoretically could have known. So only in that kind of situation are we going to be strict about impurity. So now Rav Gidl, in the name of Rav, is going to quote a different way of learning this second halacha, not about the private domain, but the one about yesh bo dat l'shael. So I'm Rav Gidl Amarav. Davar sheyesh bo dat l'shael ve'ein bo dat l'shael mehai kra nafka. This differentiation between whether there's a human involved or not a human involved is learned out from a different pasuk. V'habasar asher yiga b'chol tameh lo ye'achel. This is sacrificial meat, which touches something tameh, will not be eaten. Now, let's derive something from that. It will not be eaten if it's tameh, which sounds like definitively tameh. Vadai tameh hu delo yachel. It can't be eaten if it's tameh. Tameh means we know it's tameh, which would imply hasafek tameh safek tahor yachel. It could be eaten if we're not sure about its status. That's what it sounds like. Ema seifa, but the end of that pasuk seems to imply the opposite, which is, right, this is saying safek we're going to be lenient with. The next part of that pasuk says, Bahabasal, when it comes to eating meat, kol tahol, we're talking about humans, any person who is pure, yochal basar, can eat sacrificial meat. Now, what does it sound like? In order to eat sacrificial meat, you have to be tahol, which means, vadai tahor hu yochal basar. You can eat the meat if you're definitely pure. Hasafek tameh safek tahor. What if you're in doubt? Lo yochal. You can't eat. Notice, right, the first part of the pasuk talks about what can't be done, and the second part of the pasuk talks about what can be done. So therefore, we're implying the opposite from each part. The first part seems to imply safek is okay. Second part seems to imply only if you're definitely tahor can you eat, but if you're not sure, you can't eat. So, elalav shmamina, how can we resolve this difference? Well, elalav shmamina. What's the difference between the first part and the second part? The first part was talking about the meat. Second part was talking about the person. Meat that's impure, that's ein bo dat l'shael. That's why we're going to be lenient about its law, because there's no human involved. So therefore, we're going to be lenient about it. When it comes to yesh bo dat l'shael, the human, because you can ask, again, they might not know, but you can add, right? There's possibility for them to know. There we're going to be strict and say the safek we're not going to allow to eat. So that teaches us the same law. So now we have the obvious question. They don't ask the question, they just give the answer, which is, why do you need both drashot? Would have been enough to learn from one or the other. Well, itzrich Rav Gidl Amarav, itzrich lemigmar misotah. We need them both. Why? Te'imi derav. Now, if it's from Rav, and we're learning safek tuma from Rav, that it all depends on, is there human intervention or not? Well, it would sound like the private public domain is a non-factor. So therefore, you can't learn it just from there, because you would only learn one criteria. You wouldn't learn the second criteria. Well, then obviously, Sotah teaches you both, so it's obviously better. So why would you need it, right? And that's why it's itzrich lemigmar misotah, which teaches you also the private domain. So now the obvious question, well, misotah, so why don't you just learn it from Sotah? You can learn both criteria. Why do you need it? Well, Sotah is unique, because why? There's two people. There's the man that causes the woman to be defiled, and there's the woman herself who becomes defiled. Both are humans. So you might have thought that in order to say safek tuma would be a problem, you would have to have both humans, okay? Like a person who's matame another person. And only in that case would we have an issue, like a tameh mate, for example. If a tameh mate touches someone else, they make them impure. So maybe only that case would be a case, right, if you learned it from Sotah. So that's why you need the other case to say, no, you just need one human involved, and that already makes it reason for doubt. Okay, then we're going to be strict with a case of doubt. Okay, so what we did so far is we explained, and I won't go back to this at the end of the daf because we're already going to be on a totally different topic. I'll summarize right now what we did so far. We had the Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael debate, and it wasn't clear in the Braita what was going on because Rabbi Yishmael was answering Rabbi Akiva from something Rabbi Akiva didn't actually say. So we ended up explaining very simply, there was something missing there. Really, Rabbi Akiva darshan 4 things. Also, the kahuna was one of them. And then we tried to explain, right, Rabbi Akiva didn't darshan all 4 because he doesn't darshan bavs. So he only had 3. The 4th came from a vachomer. Why did Rabbi Akiva learn the 4th from a vachomer? So we said either maybe he did, and there was just a pasuk that added what could be learned from a vachomer, or he learned it first, the other one, right? First the kahuna, and only after that the truma, and that's why he couldn't get to a vachomer. Then we brought this thing about Rav Gidl in the name of Rav, who basically brings a different pasuk, an alternative pasuk for the davar sheyesh bo da'at l'shael, and then we explain why you need both. Okay, why you need to learn from both places. Now we're going back to the Mishnah. You remember the Mishnah started off with Rabbi Akiva, who says, okay, the second case in our Mishnah was Bo bayom darash Rabbi Akiva kli cheres asher yipol mitocho asher yipol el tocho kol asher b'tocho yitma. If, sorry, I didn't read the whole pasuk. Kli cheres, where a sheretz falls into the airspace of the kli cheres, already, right, the entire vessel is impure. And not only that, right, what does he say? But it says yitma. Yitma means if there's something in that vessel which becomes a sheni, because again, the sheretz is a rishon. This is very important to understand all these stages. Sorry, the sheretz is an avatuma. I just said that wrong. Sheretz is an avatuma. Avatuma creates the kli will be a rishon. The kli then can be mitame only food to be a sheni. So that's what's in the kli, yitma. That's what the pasuk says. Comes Rabbi Akiva and says yitma is written as yitma because you can read it as yitameh. That sheni can go on and pass on to a shlishi even when it comes to chulin. Comes Rabbi Yoshua and says, oh wow, too bad Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is not here anymore. Because he was worried that what? That in future generations, people are going to say there's no pasuk for a shlishi in the Torah, and they're going to permit shlishi. They're going to say there is no such thing as a shlishi. And now we have a pasuk, we have a source for it. Now it gets a little bit tricky because Rabbi Akiva was saying that the sheni can make a shlishi. Okay, 1 second. I just want to see something. Okay, wait. Okay, a sheni can make a shlishi when it comes to only truma or sacrificial meat. But Rabbi Akiva has this opinion; it can even make chulin. But when Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is worried that people are going to be b'taher the shlishi, he means truma, really. And the whole discussion we're going to have about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai here is really only talking about a shlishi and truma. And now what Rabbi Akiva was talking about, even in chulin, even in non-sacred stuff. Okay? That's just a distinction we're going to put aside. Rabbi Akiva was talking about it can even make a shlishi when it comes to sacred, non-sacred items. But when Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is worried that people are going to come along, they're going to say there's no pasuk for shlishi anywhere. So therefore, people are going to come and say there's no such thing as shlishi by truma. Okay, so again, I'm going to explain to you very clearly what happens. Sheretz, or a person, right, who's tamei avatuma, can touch a vessel or a person or food, make them into a rishon. That rishon can only be tamei food, to be a sheni. In the case of truma, which is what the kohanim eat, or sacrificial meat or meal offerings or things like that, the truma, right, so again, you can have food that's a sheni will pass on impurity to a shlishi, and shlishi can pass on impurity to a revi'i only if it's kachim. So kachim is the highest level, sacrificial step. Truma is right below that. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. So now comes the Gemara, and the Gemara says, okay, we're now going back to Kaftet. So first they just quote Bo bayom darash Rabbi Akiva kol cheres, but now we're really questioning Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and they say the following: Me'achar de'ein lo lama tamei. If you don't have a pasuk, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, then why are you so concerned about this people being mitahel shlishi and saying there's no such thing as shlishi when it comes to truma? There's no pasuk, so how serious could it be? And where do you even get this, that there's a shlishi? To which he says, Amar Rav Yudah Amar Rav. Here starts the complicated part of today's stuff. I'm going to share screen with the study guide so you can follow along. Okay, this will help. So our first chart. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, Minatorah ein lo, midin kal vachomer yesh. So I told you we're going to have a lot of kal vachomers today. Same thing as Rabbi Yishmael. He says, right, we don't have a pasuk, but we do have a kal vachomer. So here also we have a kal vachomer. Uma tvul yom. What's a tvul yom? Tvul yom is someone who either was tamei for 1 day or could be tamei for 7 days. On the 7th day or on the day they become tamei, depending on what type of impurity you have, you go to the mikveh in the morning usually. The rest of that day, you're in the status of a tvul yom. We're going to see all sorts of things about a tvul yom today. The first thing to know is that a tvul yom is allowed to eat chulin. Okay, there's no problem with that. That's obvious. And doesn't mess up. Okay, he can eat chulin, but he's posel b'truma. Okay, which means number one, he was impure before he went to the mikveh. He only becomes fully pure when the night comes. Okay, this was the very first Mishnah in Shas, which is Me'matai korin shma ba'aravin, right? When can you reach Shema at night? When the kohanim nechnesim lechol b'trumatam. When can they eat their truma? once it gets dark out, because until that point, they can't eat truma, and they actually disqualify truma. So says the following, the vachomer, a tvul yom who's permitted to eat chulin, and yet is posel b'truma, right, can't eat truma, kikar sheni shepasul b'chulin eino din she'aseh shlishi b'truma. You have to kind of live with the fact that we're making a little bit of a strange comparison, because we're comparing a person who's in a certain level of impurity to an object, a kikar sheni, a loaf, okay, which is, now, to say a tvul yom is allowed to eat chulin is not the same as saying a kikar sheni is pasul b'chulin. What does that mean? Well, something that became impure to second degree impurity is disqualified even if it's chulin, right? Meaning a loaf that went into an oven where a sheretz had been in, right? The loaf becomes second degree impurity because the vessel is, the oven is first degree impurity, right? Which came from the avatuma, which was the sheretz. So a kikar sheni, we're going to say now, is more severe than a tvul yom, because a tvul yom is, again, this mutar b'chulin, pasul b'chulin are not exactly comparable terms, but they both relate to chulin. A tvul yom can eat chulin. A kikar sheni is disqualified if it's chulin. Okay, again, chulin is just non-safe. So eino din. So if you accept, okay, you have to just accept this, that this shows that tvul yom is lighter because of the chulin, right? It's got no effect on chulin. Well, in that case, since the tvul yom disqualifies truma, if I'm a tvul yom and I touch truma, I disqualify it. I can't eat truma if I'm a tvul yom. Well, kikar sheni shepasul b'chulin eino din she'aseh shlishi b'truma. So shouldn't also the kikar sheni pass on impurity to truma? So that's his vachomer. Now comes the Gemara and starts questioning his vachomer. You can knock out a vachomer basically by saying this. Now, we thought the tvul yom is lighter because of the chulin issue, but maybe there's something strict about a tvul yom, which is what causes it to have the ability to not, right? The tvul yom, for example, can't eat truma. Let's talk about. Well, maybe because of that, they're pasul b'truma, but not, right, because of their sad chamol, because they're not as, it's light in one way, but it's strict in a different way. And maybe that strictness, severity is what causes our halacha, which means you can't learn a vachomer anymore. Because unless the kikar sheni has that same stringency, which it's not going to have, well, then you could say that stringency causes it to be disqualified and to disqualify truma. So let's try to see what that is. You can knock out this vachomer and say the following. Ma tvul yom shekain avatuma. A tvul yom can actually be an avatuma. What does that mean? If I come in contact with a dead body, right, and then I become impure for 7 days. Once I'm impure for 7 days, what happens? I go to the mikvah on the 7th day, and then I'm a tvul yom. So there's cases of a tvul yom where I myself could be an avatuma, okay, because a dead body is aviavotatuma. It's like a much higher level even than a sheretz, right? The sheretz is an avatuma. If I come in contact with the dead body, I am myself called an avatuma. So a tvul yom is a chumrah because I can even be a tvul yom could potentially have been an avatuma themselves. Now, you'll see in a minute, they're not saying because it's an avatuma and a kikar sheni is only a sheni and it's a lower level. They're saying avatuma is in a totally different category from rishon, sheni, and all those other, because they're more indirect, right? It's already come in contact with something they came in contact with. But an avatuma itself is serious. So because a tvul yom is an avatuma in some cases, that makes it very strict. Maybe that's why a tvul yom can't have truma, okay? And then that would be a different reason that wouldn't affect the kikar sheni, which means, right, you can't learn from there to a second degree impurity, which is totally different and much lighter in that sense. So maybe you wouldn't learn that it's possible true. So they say, I'm turning now to Amud Bet. Okay, you're worried about a tvul yom that can be an avatuma? Well, there's all sorts of tvul yom. So teitimi tvul yom to sheretz. So just amend the vachomer and say what he meant when he said tvul yom. You don't even have to change it. You just say, he meant tvul yom of a sheretz, meaning someone who was a human who came in contact with a creepy crawly creature, one of the shretzim, and then became impure. That would be a rishon. Rishon sheni already, that's similar. That's not, doesn't have this strictness of an avatum. But they say, no, you could still say that that has a tzad chamor, a strict side, because what? Ma l'tvul yom d'sheretz, even if you say a tvul yom of sheretz, shekem b'mino avatum. Now it's true that tvul yom of sheretz can never be an avatuma, but tvul yom as a category could relate to things that are avatumas. It could be you're a human who's an avatuma. So even though tvul yom of sheretz is not so severe, but since in that category of tvul yom there is a strict case, you could say maybe that's what causes a tvul yom to have this strict thing that's possible truma, which then you couldn't apply to this kikar sheni. All along, we're going this back and forth to try to figure out, is there what we call a tzad chamor which would then ruin our vachomer in the tvul yom. So then they say, well, kli cheres yochia. Okay, an earthenware vessel could prove it. Why? An earthenware vessel doesn't have bimino avatuma, okay, and yet it can pass on impurity to a shlishi, okay. So now we're going to say, or it can actually forget that it can passel truma, right? If I have a vessel that's a rishon, okay, kli cheres, and I have a loaf of bread in there that's truma, that will ruin it. So you now have two things. You have tvul yom, and you have a kli cheres, which disqualifies truma. So from there, you can learn to this kikar sheni. So now they're going to say, but no, because then what does this prove basically? Since the stringency that we had in the tvul yom, this is a classic argumentation of a vachomer. Since the stringency we had in the tvul yom, which was that it could potentially be an avatuma, even if it's not, doesn't exist in a kli cheres, because a kli cheres can never be an avatuma because there's no such thing, right? If a kli cheres comes in contact with a dead body, it's a rishon. It's not an avatuma. Okay, you can't have a kli cheres avatuma. So, ma kli cheres sheken. So now we're going to say that proves that the severity of being able to have a type of the tvul yom could be an avatuma doesn't exist in something else that would be the same as it. So that would prove that it's not the stringency of it could be an avatuma that causes it to pass truma, in which case you bring your vachomer back. But because the whole thing was maybe that's the stringency that causes it, and that doesn't exist in kikar sheni, but it also doesn't exist in kli cheres, and kli cheres does disqualify truma, which means that you could learn kikar sheni from both of them. But then they say, ma the kli cheres shekema tamei me'aviro, but kli cheres has its own stringency. So then you could say, the tvul yom has a stringency that it could be an avatuma. The kli cheres has a stringency that you can be metame. The sheretz is metame just from coming into the airspace of it without actually touching it. That's a unique halacha by an earthenware vessel. That just by coming into the airspace of this kli cheres, you can actually be metame the entire kli cheres even without touching it. So it has its own stringency. To which they say, okay, well, that doesn't prove anything because tvul yom yochia, because right. Then you could say, look, this has a stringency and this has a stringency, but since this is not the same stringency as that, it's obviously not that stringency that's proving it, and it's not that stringency that's proving it that causes the truma, which means you could learn a vachomer from both of them, really. To which they say, but no, lo rizeh kerizeh v'lo rizeh kerizeh. This one doesn't look like that one. That one doesn't look like that one. But they do have a tzara shaveh shebehem. They have the least common denominator between them. What is that? Shehem mutarim bechulin uposlim b'truma. Okay, this line is incredibly complicated, and all the commentaries say something's wrong here. Because what do you mean they're mutarim b'chulin? They're not mutarim b'chulin. A kli cheres is pasul b'chulin. It's tameh in chulin. So this doesn't make any sense. Rashi changes it, although we're going to see it's also complicated to understand this line, even with Rashi's emendation. A whole bunch of Rishonim change it in all different ways because it really makes no sense. And now we're stuck because we don't really know what the least common denominator is between these, but we're going to say the following. Let's go with Rashi. The least common denominator is that both of these things in the Torah are called tameh. Okay? They're called tameh, and they pass on impurity also to truma. They're poslim b'truma. So therefore, kol shekain kikar sheni sheposel b'chulin deposel b'truma. Okay, so now back to our chart. So now let's pull up the chart for a minute. We now go back and say, so we're going to change the chart a little. I didn't change this because it's hard to do things three-dimensional in charts. But at this point, we're going to say, the vachomer is the tvul yom and the kli cheres. And it's tricky. What's unique about them both? They're tme'im. Okay, now we were looking for something that was a kula. That's a bit of a problem here. We were looking originally, it's mutter b'chulin versus the kikar sheni, which is pasul b'chulin, right? Because a tvul yom can eat chulin, whereas a kikar sheni is disqualified if it's chulin, right? That's any, right, chulin item that came in contact with the rishon is going to be disqualified. So now they say the following. So let's just read it again. So the two of them, mutarim b'chulin and poslin b'truma. Again, we have to change mutarim b'chulin to tmeim. They're both called tamei in the Torah. Now, maybe what it means here is tamei usually means it itself is impure, but not that it passes on impurity. And yet they pass on impurity to truma. So kol shekain, here's the tricky part. Why is it a kol shekain when it's really almost like they're equivalent and not exactly in a way of vachomer, but I'm going to leave that as a question. Kol shekain kikar sheni sheposa b'chulin deposa b'truma. Okay? So from there, we conclude our vachomer from the two of them together, the tvul yom and the klicheres. We're going to learn that since they are disqualified for truma, kikar sheni also can pass on impurity to truma. Okay, a sheni passes on impurity to a shlishi, even though this is quite a complicated vachomer to understand. And again, not just it's hard to follow, but the conclusion isn't 100% really sounding like a vachomer. Like I said, there's a lot of problems with the girsa, which is why everyone's kind of struggling with this topic, but we're going to leave it at that. That's his vachomer. Now the question is, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, basically what happened? He told us, I'm worried that some future generation is going to come and say that and change this law and say that a kikar sheni can't pass on impurity to a shlishi. To which, right, we basically, all we did so far in this section is say, so where did he get it from? If he didn't have a source in the pasuk, where did he get it from? It must be this vachomer, and it took us a while to understand this vachomer, and even now we're still a little confused. Now they want to come and explain, well, what was he worried about that people were going to come and say? So that's the next part. Now they say, Vidor acher parich, what will the next generation question, right? And knock out this vachomer? Well, exactly what we just said, right? In other words, they'll say, what do you mean the least common denominator? Both the tvul yom has its own stringency, the klicheres has its own stringency, and they could say, maybe it's true, that's not the same stringency as that, but maybe each of those stringencies independently is what causes the din about the truma in those, which then can't be applied to the kikar sheni, which doesn't have those stringencies at all. So that's what he was worried people were going to come and complain about, and knock out his vachomer, in which case, since there's no source in the Torah, he'd be stuck, right? They'd get rid of this halacha entirely. And Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai, why was he not concerned about that himself? Like, why did he not think that? What's vachomer lo parith? He goes by this least common denominator. He's okay. He doesn't think if this one has its vachomer and this one has its vachomer, that knocks it out. As long as they have this least common denominator between them, which is not such a stringency, then we can learn from there to something else. Okay, that was part one of this section. Okay, so just to do a quick review, we had this braita, right? I'm sorry, we had this Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai in the Mishnah, who said, I'm worried what's going to happen. They said, where did you even get this from? That sheni passes on a shlishi, if not from the Torah? Answer is vachomer. You have to figure out exactly what that vachomer is. I would say it kind of ends with not exactly vachomer, but more like they're both very similar. So let's learn from here to there, more like maybe a binyanav. It's more a little bit like a paradigm, at least the way Rashi understands it. And then we say the other ones would knock it out and say, no, right? What he was worried about is they would come and say, each one has a stringency in the first category, the tvul yom and the klicheres. From there, you couldn't necessarily learn to a regular sheni, which could pass on impurity to truma and disqualify it. That was all about sheni passing on impurity to a shlishi if it's truma. Okay, that was the topic. Now, since we're already on this topic, they bring up another question, which is a braita where Rabbi Yosi says, Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yosi. Now we're going to have the exact same kind of structure here, which is Rabbi Yosi is going to say, Minayin l'revi'i b'kodesh. How do you know that when it comes to a shlishi, it can pass on impurity to a revi'i, to a fourth degree impurity, if it's sacrificial meat, sacrificial wine, sacrificial meal offering, right? Whatever is on a level of what we call kodesh kodshim. How do you know that there's revi'i b'kodesh, a pasul? Okay. Vidinhu. So again, he's going to say a vachomer, and it's going to be very similar. Ma mechusar kipurim. Okay, we're going to have, and here's the next chart on the page. What's a mechusar kipurim? That's someone like a Zava, Yoledet, Metzora, all these kind of people that have a 7-day process. They finish it. They go to the mikvah on day 7. By the time the sun sets that night, they're good, right? What do we mean? That means they can eat truma. That's what we saw about the kohanim. They can eat truma that night. They're not impure anymore. However, they're missing one element, which is the next day they're supposed to bring a sacrifice. As long as they haven't brought a sacrifice, they can't eat sacrificial meat. So in the same way the tvul yom couldn't eat truma in the morning after they went to the mikvah, the mechusar kipurim, after he goes to the mikvah and the sun sets that day, he still can't eat sacrificial meat. He or she brings a korban. That sacrifice permits them to eat sacrificial meat again. Okay? So now, that's just a basic law of mechusar kipurim. So here comes our vachomer. Ma mechusar kipurim shemutar b'truma. They can eat truma. Remember, I just said that, and yet they're pasul b'kodesh. They can't eat sacrificial meat or sacrificial items. Shlishi, so a shlishi, which is pasul b'truma. Again, this is just like we said. The kikar sheni was pasul b'chulim because that is what it is. A shlishi disqualifies truma, meaning a shlishi itself is, if it's truma, it's disqualified. Ein odin she'aseh revi'i b'kodesh. So since the mechusar kipurim is permitted in truma and yet is pasul b'kodesh, shlishi, which is can't, right? It's a problem if it's truma. All the more so should be able to pass on impurity to a revi. So that's a vachomer. So now they say, B'lamanu shlishi lakodesh min haTorah urevi mi vachomer. And now Rabbi Yosi continues and makes another statement. We'll have to explain in a second, which is shlishi for sacrificial meat. We actually learn from a pasuk. The revi, the fact they pass on impurity, we learn from this vachomer that I just said. So shlishi lakodesh min haTorah minai. And where do we get a pasuk that talks about a shlishi? Dichtiv. As it says, Habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yachel. We just quoted this pasuk earlier in today's daf, right? The meat which touches any tamei can't be eaten. Milo askinan denaga b'sheni, right? It says meat that touches any tamei. Any tamei should include what levels of tamei do we have in the Torah? Rishon sheni. So wouldn't it be mentioning even if it touches a sheni, which b'amar rachmana lo yachel? So what do you see here? You can't eat a shlishi when it comes to meat, because meat that touches something that's tamei, which presumably was a sheni, or included even a sheni, is impure. So there we have the shlishi and the revi mi vachomer kedamaran, as we already said. Now Rabbi Yochanan is going to come and question Rabbi Yosi, and we're toward the end of our daf now, last line of argumentation. He wants to go back now to the previous chart and say, wait, this vachomer that Rabbi Yosi said could be knocked out from a different case. Tam b'ribi eini yodea ma. Okay, beribi is his way of talking about Rabbi Yosi. The reasoning, he says, I don't get. Shalei tshuvato b'tzido. A tshuva is usually an answer, but in the Gemara, it's also a question. Tshuva comes to the word lahashiv, a response. A response could be a response of a question. So here's my question. Ochel haba machmat tvul yom yochiach. Food, okay, now, we're going to learn a new thing. There's a 3-way machloket about a tvul yom. The rabbis basically were strict with a tvul yom and said that a tvul yom carries impurity also. They can cause things to become impure even once they've gone to the mikvah until the sun is set. And there's a 3-way machloket. And we're now going to say Rabbi Yochanan's kushya is based on the third opinion, the rabbi's opinion in this machloket. Okay, there's Abba Shaul, Rabbi Meir, Chachamim. We're going to learn their opinions and then we'll end with this question. So he says the following. Tvul yom yochiach shepasul b'truma ve'eno se revi b'kodesh. A tvul yom disqualifies truma, but can't, whatever he disqualifies its truma, which is a shlishi, it doesn't go any farther than that. He can't turn something into revi in kodshim. So that would then prove that this whole vachomer is off, because you could say a shlishi b'truma is pasul b'truma, but doesn't pass on to revi, just like food that comes in contact with a tvul yom. So we're going to see this now inside. Ditanya, Abba Shaul Omer. Like I said, forget opinion 1 and 2 right now. I mean, we're going to learn it. And it's important to learn because we're going to continue with it in the Gemara. But right now, what we're focusing on for our question is opinion number 3. Tvul yom, tchila lekodesh, l'tamei shnayim v'lifsol echad. A tvul yom is, okay, say it's called a tchila lekodesh, which means what? It can start off impurity, which means what? It's a rishon. Okay, a tvul yom is like a rishon, which means what? L'tamei shnayim, he can be mitame a sheni, okay? In other words, a tvul yom touches food, turns it into a sheni, and that sheni can turn right? It's litame. It passes on impurity twice to a truma, okay, to a shlishi, and lifsol lachad, and it can disqualify a revi. So basically, if I'm a tvul yom and I touch food, which touches truma, which touches kodshim, all of those are going to be impure. I'm sorry, skipped one. Rabbi Meir says, wait, the rabbis only had to go 2 levels because the rabbis considered a tvul yom sheni, which means that they can only make a shlishi impure if it's truma or kodshim, and that will make a revi. So it goes 2 levels, but it starts from sheni, goes to shlishi revi. But chachamim omrim, kashem sheposel ochlei truma umashkei truma. This is what we were looking for. Just like it can disqualify food of truma and drinks of truma, kach posel ochlei kodesh umashkei kodesh. It can disqualify kodshim, okay, by touching it, meaning it can be a sheni, it can mess up truma and kodshim, but it can't pass on impurity to a revi'i. It could only go 1 level of shlishi. Can't go to revi'i. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Look, I can use this case of food that comes from a tvul yom, according to the rabbi's opinion, that when they establish that the tvul yom is going to pass on impurity, they pass it on only 1 level. They're a sheni, they pass on to a shlishi. Even if that food came in contact with sacrificial meat, it won't do anything to it. So here you see an example where something disqualifies truma but doesn't pass on to become a revi. So likewise, you could say the same thing with the shlishi. Maybe there is no such thing as revi b'kodesh. So matkef la Rav Papa, and we'll end with his question. You can just very simply say, why is Rabbi Yochanan questioning Rabbi Yosi from the rabbi's opinion? Why don't you just say, because remember, we had Abba Shaul and even Rabbi Meir, who said that a tvul yom could pass on impurity to Revi. So Rabbi Yochanan, you're asking a question from the rabbis, you could say Rabbi Yosi just holds like Abba Shaul, or maybe even Rabbi Meir. The Gemara is asking specifically about Abba Shaul. So tomorrow, I'm going to stop right here and leave it for tomorrow, why the Gemara is going to say, if he held like Abba Shaul, then he would have said something else. Okay, and we'll get to that tomorrow because this is already a lot for today. And from here, we're going to end. So again, what we did in this last section, which again, I admit was a complicated section, but the structure of it is actually quite clear, which is first, we tried to figure out on what basis did Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai say, if there's no pasuk in the Torah, on what basis does he say that a sheni passes on to a shlishi when it comes to truma? And then we said, on what basis was he worried that people were going to disagree with him? And we came up with this vachomer that we had to prove. Took a little while to really clarify it fully. Then, once we said, where's the source for a shlishi, then we got to where's the source for revi when it comes to sacrificial meat. From that, we brought Rabbi Yosi's vachomer. And then we said shlishi comes from a pasuk, revi comes from this vachomer. Rabbi Yochanan questioned the vachomer based on the opinion of the rabbis. And we were left with the question of saying, well, why didn't Rabbi Yosi could just say, I don't hold by the rabbis, I hold by Abba Shaul, where there is a revi. Okay, that was the structure of what we did. Again, a bit complicated. If you review the daf, you'll see it gets easier as you look at it a second time. And if not, and that's okay too. And we'll move on tomorrow and continue where we left off, and then continue in this sugya about the Rishon Sheni Shlishi Revi, all that. Have a great day, everybody.